Let us use our natural resources to bring housing and education and health care. And that is their crime. And so what is happening in Venezuela is very, very cynical. And perhaps I should just spend a little time on this, because our people turn on their TV sets and they see CNN and MSNBC and the BBC and Fox, and they see certain images and they hear a certain story and they simply believe it. So you tell people you're going to Venezuela and they're scared for you, but the whole country is aflame in violence and chaos. And you go to Venezuela, you walk around Caracas, violence and chaos here. Yes, there are opposition forces that do organize very selected, very orchestrated, selected violent street actions that the media houses then film and magnify 100 times over and send it out to the world. Or they tell you, oh, you read these stories. People in Caracas are so hungry and starving, they're eating cats and dogs. And you walk around the streets of Caracas, there's food there, there's nobody starving, there's nobody eating out of garbage cans. So these Western media houses have such a tremendous power, not simply to distort reality, I would say to create reality. And when these powerful Western governments, like the government of the United States, like the government of Britain, like the government of Canada, when they decide that you are their enemy and you are to be destroyed, then they put their media houses to work on you. And you say, you give a dog a bad name and you can kill it. Well, they set out very consciously to give that dog a bad name so that they can kill it. And all these street protests, I mean, the Venezuelan authorities, the Venezuelan government has been so careful to rein in the police. These opposition people, many of them coming from fascist backgrounds, who hire thugs and people with paramilitary backgrounds to engage in violent street activities designed to provoke the police. They attack the police with Molotov cocktails and other missiles, and they want to provoke a response. I think the Venezuelan government has tried to be very, very restrained, but the way it is reported, somebody gets killed in one of these street protests, and there was a demonstration against the Venezuelan government in Caracas today, and three people were killed. And the impression is given that here are these peaceful demonstrators, and a repressive government and police and military have killed, when it's quite often just the other way around. Quite often the violence that leads to death and injury emanates from the same organized opposition protesters. And something that has escaped our notice, part of their campaign has been to actually carry out lynchings of black people. There's, I don't know if anybody knows the name Orlando Figueroa. Well, he was the first victim, Orlando Figueroa. Because if you're black in Venezuela, it is likely that you're Chavista. Because if you're black, it means you are likely to have come from the poorest sections of the community, and that it is likely that you gravitated towards supporting Chavez and his socialist revolution. So these opposition, violent people are holding one of their orchestrated street protests, and this 21-year-old young black man called Orlando Figueroa, he's walking down that street in Caracas, and he simply happens to walk into the activity that they are holding. They grab hold of the young man. Based on the color of his skin, they accuse him of being a Chavista, and he probably was a Chavista. But for them, that is a crime. They beat the young man, they stab him 6 times, they douse him with gasoline, and they set him on fire. Orlando Figueroa died a week later in hospital. He was the first victim. But they have set something like 28 people on fire. And several of them have been killed. That is never reported. You will never see that on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation News. You will never see that on the BBC. You will never see that on CNN. I consider it a 21st century lynching, because that kind of barbarity seems to be reserved by these opposition hooligans for dark-skinned or black Venezuelans, who they identify as Chavistas. So this is what is happening in Venezuela. And in the midst of that, here comes the Canadian government to do what? Not to call for dialogue or to be critical of this fascist, violent opposition, but to impose sanctions on President Maduro and his administration. So I'm saying, brothers and sisters, that you have a responsibility to see through this image of the benign Canada. You have a responsibility to see this country, for what it is. For what it is. Yes, I have no doubt there are many good things about Canada, but the reality is it is an important component of a world imperialist system. If the United States is seen as the big cog in that wheel and Canada is a little cog, it is still a cog in that mechanism. And you have a responsibility to see it, to recognize it, to fight it, to object to it, to give solidarity to its victims, such as Venezuela. And Venezuela, I tell you, speaking from the vantage point of the Caribbean, Venezuela is very important to us. Very, very important. Cuba was always there, standing up to the United States, championing our sovereignty and independence and self-respect. But for many years, it was Cuba virtually all alone. Then Chavez came on the scene. And Chavez came at a critical time because, neoliberalism was riding roughshod over our region. The United States government was insisting on imposing a so-called free trade area of the Americas on us, where it wasn't really about free trade. It was about a powerful American system basically imposing itself on these smaller countries in a way in which we would have been totally dominated economically. And many of our leaders felt they could not resist. They were reluctantly going along with it. Even in my country, our prime minister said, he was preparing Barbados for immersion in the free trade area of the Americas. And then along comes Hugo Chavez and Lula da Silva in Brazil. And they started the attack on the free trade area of the Americas. They, largely because of these two leaders and these two countries, they derailed that American imperialist project. And in its place, they put institutions like the Petro-Caribe Energy Cooperation Agreement and ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for Latin America and the Caribbean. So, those programs were a godsend, particularly for small Eastern Caribbean nations. If you cast your mind back to that period, 2007, 2008, when the world went into serious recession, were it not for Petro-Caribe, which is not simply about energy supplies, but also about developmental assistance, social and economic developmental assistance. Were it not for Petro-Caribe and the assistance given by Venezuela, several of our small Eastern Caribbean islands would really have gone under. So we are saying, this sister country of the Caribbean, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, just like Cuba, very important to us. In fact, when I speak of the Caribbean, I think of Cuba in the north, Venezuela in the south, and all the islands in between. And for me, that is our Caribbean civilization that we have to protect and nurture and build. And so we need your help and your solidarity coming from Canada to protect and build that civilization. Last month, October, we held a very important conference in Barbados. It was termed the first Caribbean Peace Conference. The organization that I'm the coordinator of the Caribbean chapter, the International Network in Defense of Humanity. Our Caribbean chapter joined together with the Jamaica Peace Council, the Guyana Peace Council, another Barbados-based organization called the Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration. And we held a peace conference, out of which we produced a document called the Bridgetown Declaration. But we came together very concerned about this man called Donald Trump and what he represents in the world today, and the threat that he constitutes. Because it seems to us that President Trump is eager to have